Hello and welcome to another installment of Module 3. Today we're going to talk about forced induction. So I don't know if you ever heard that term or not, but let's get started. Okay, so what is forced induction? Basically, forced induction is the mechanical process to deliver higher than ambient pressures into the combustion cylinder. What does that mean? Well, remember way back when we talked about how atmospheric air and fuel gets into the combustion chamber, so you start that four-stroke process. Remember intake, compression, power, and exhaust. Well, on the intake, many people think when the cylinder is going down, it's sucking air into the cylinder, but actually what's happening is it's creating less than atmospheric pressure. So I want to say a vacuum, but it's less than atmospheric pressure, and that varies based on where you're at on elevation. But when that cylinder goes down, it creates less than atmospheric pressure. What that does is it allows the atmospheric pressure to push into that cylinder, that air and fuel charge. When we're talking forced induction, we're actually using a mechanical device. It's a process. It's an impeller, a compressor that's going to take that and force that air into there higher than ambient pressure. So let's say you're at about sea level, 14.7 pounds a square inch. A turbocharger can double that. It's going to push that air into a higher rate. So why would we use forced induction? And I ask you, why not? Next question. Just kidding. So why do we use forced induction? Early applications included aviation due to the lack of pressures at higher altitude and the reliance of atmospheric pressures to enter the combustion chamber. What that basically means is what I was mentioning earlier. We need atmospheric pressures to push that air into the cylinder so we can put fuel in there and cause it to go bang, right? Well, higher up in altitude, like I mentioned, you get less atmospheric pressure. So aviation often had a problem with this, and their solution were forced induction. And then so that's where it kind of started. So basically for us in the automotive world, more air means more fuel. More fuel and more air means more bang, more power. Right? So this picture shows kind of a fuel mapping on a software. And what I mean by fuel mapping is that at any given load, calculation, characteristic, where that engine's running, based on the PCM's calculations, it's going to determine how much fuel, how long the millisecond is on the duration of the fuel injectors, how much fuel for what air, what temperature is the air, throttle position sensors. All this data has to go into calculating how much fuel. If we can pack more air in there, and that maybe cooler temperatures we'll talk about later, we can pack more fuel. That gives us a bigger bang when the spark plug ignites that combustion mixture. So that's kind of why we use it. It's all about power. But then how do we do that? So there's basically two main types of forced induction components or compressors that we use to force the air into the combustion chamber. They are turbochargers, which we have one right here, and superchargers. Here's a variant of one right here. There are different styles we'll talk about in a little bit, but those are basically the gist. When we talk about forced induction, we're talking about turbochargers and superchargers. So basically, turbochargers are these compressors that are driven by expanding gases that flow through the exhaust. It's not just the movement of exhaust gases; it's the heat, it's the expansion as it goes past this turbine. Get my mouse here. Right here is the turbine. So as exhaust comes down and channeled, actually right here, comes up through here around this, and is channeled through these veins on this turbine, it's going to cause this to move, and that's the expanding gases that process as it evacuates out of this outlet right here, this turbo. We'll talk more about how it works later, but basically that's how this is driven. It's attached to the shaft as it comes over to the impeller. This is on the intake side, and then as air is coming in right here from atmosphere air, it's going to hit this impeller. This is spinning due to this being moved by the exhaust gases, and it's going to compress up through into out and around this tube. This is a cutaway, and it comes out through here to the intake. That's basically how the turbocharger works. Too much boost can damage the engine, so turbochargers are regulated with a wastegate and or variable vanes in the turbine, VGT, VGT turbo, variable geometry turbo, let's spit that out. So right here, here's your turbine that I was showing that picture before. So right here, see that turbine? We're going to look at it from this side actually, right up here. So here's on the back of it, this turbine right here is before it goes down out the outlet. Right here is your wastegate. So under certain operating conditions, this can be operated via a diaphragm or electronic. what's going to happen is if there's too much pressure in the system, this wastegate opens, and that allows exhaust gases to bypass this turbine coming from the cylinder. So that's kind of basically the gist how the wastegate works. When it comes to the VGT, inside this housing right here, there's the turbine. You have this housing that has these blades right here that are adjustable. They're going to get closer, concentrating that nozzle, or opening up, expanding that nozzle, which directs air onto this turbine as exhaust comes out. And these are self-regulating, basically for depending on load, engine speed, etc. But basically, turbochargers do have some maintenance issues with them. So they do create lots of heat. And so to remove some of that heat, they're equipped with a cooling system. Also, it's engine cooling and oil. Whoops, we get it right here. So right here we have an oil thread coming in. You can see it get pressurized right here. So the engine oil that's pressurized from the engine oil pump is going to come down through here in this channel, and it's going to come down and work its way to these bearings and this shaft right here, and it's going to lubricate these bearings, and it's going to come out the bottom. Well, it's hard to see right here, but the oil comes back out and returns down to the oil pan. Over here we have some coolant passages right here where coolant's going to come in, and it's going to circulate around to keep that cool. The cooler we keep that turbo, the less the oil is going to heat up and coke and carbon and create problems with these bearings right here. So the idea is you want to try and keep this cool as possible. So here's a picture actually of what some of that coking looks like. As oil gets hot and bakes, it's going to turn this carbonized, this coke gunk mess. This gets on the bearings, it gets on all kinds of stuff. So basically, you're going to want to use synthetic oil, a good quality synthetic oil. Change that oil as recommended by the manufacturer. I'm an OE guy, meaning original equipment. I like to do what the manufacturer recommends. So that's kind of my thing. There are some caveats to that, some exceptions to that rule, but when in doubt, I just do what the OE recommends. So again, use a good quality synthetic oil, change it as recommended. And then when I had turbo vehicles, I what's called idle down after spirited driving, meaning if you're driving a bit zealous, a little bit lead foot, you're going to want to let that turbo cool down. So idling down refers to just letting the vehicle idle, letting that coolant and oil run through that turbo and remove as much heat as possible. I would do it for a couple minutes, depending on how spirited you were when you were driving it, is how long I would do that. And again, if you're looking at buying a turbocharged vehicle, if you remove the boot that goes to the impeller or the turbo, you're going to see that impeller right there. If you put your finger on that shaft right there and move it up and down or left and right, you basically want to move it radially and then move it in and out. So you're checking for end play movement or radial movement, and you're basically checking for worn bearings is what you're doing. Worn bearings is going to be sucking a lot of oil because the bushings in there can't take up that much movement. So when the bearings wear out, the shaft starts moving around, you get mechanical damage, you get burning oil. They can be very expensive, so this is something you want to be just be aware of. And then here's that picture again we were looking at with the oil and the coolant. This is the shaft I'm talking about. When you take this shaft and you're moving it up and down, you're going to be looking for that movement, which is indicative of this bearing being worn. In and out is going to check for end play also, making sure there's no too much axial movement or radial movement on this turbo housing. So superchargers, basically they're still using the compressor to force air into that combustion chamber, but they're going to be a little bit different. So instead of using the exhaust gases to move that turbine, these have variants that are driven off the crankshaft. Right here you have our roots, there's this vane, the screw, and then a centrifugal. Looks like half of a turbo. Basically the centrifugal supercharger is the impeller side of a turbo, and the back is driven off the belt, the crankshaft. So very similar to the turbo, but a little bit different, more self-contained. Here's a picture of the roots or vane style supercharger. You're going to get that mount on top of the engine. This little snout comes out right here, driven off this pulley, and this belt comes down to the crankshaft, etc. So air comes in through, it gets compressed, and then down into the engine. And then here's your centrifugal style. Looks like a turbo hanging off the side of the engine, but you'll notice they're in the front of the engine and they're not attached to the exhaust. And it's driven off a belt. And those are your clues that it's a supercharger, not a turbocharger. Here's a picture of that roots or vane style up top, and then driven off that big belt right there. And then here's a picture of a centrifugal one with that belt kind of hidden, kind of hard to see based on this mount right here, this mounting plate. But basically here it is right here in the impeller, and that compresses it into the engine there. Basically, so the turbo is adjusted by that wastegate to control that turbine speed. It's driven off exhausts. A supercharger is driven off of the crankshaft, so its boost is regulated via these pulleys. You get an under pulley to spin faster, or a larger pulley to spin slower. So it's directly rated to the pulley side. There's no need for a wastegate on these. And then also a little bit of maintenance on these. They do have oil to keep cool as well, but they're going to have a little plug right here. Since they're basically self-contained sealed unit, the oil to lubricate is housed separate from the engine oil. Routine maintenance includes taking this plug out right here and checking the level of the oil. And just note that it is a special oil, and it should be to the bottom of those threads right there. So whether you're using a turbo or a supercharger, there is a need for a bypass valve or blow-off valve. Basically what this does is it removes that pressure when you shut the throttle plate, the throttle body right here. When you shut that, all that charged air is going to come slamming up against that throttle body. So it's going to remove that charged air, bypassing it to the uncharged side of the intake. And that's basically what's going to happen. In fact, this is a pretty good picture here that's going to show us, this is a turbocharged diagram. Here's that wastegate. So as exhaust gases come out, it goes through that turbine and out. If you want it to bypass the turbo to control boost, you open up this wastegate, and then exhaust gases bypass it out. It's kind of a diagram style. So, but on the intake side, if this impeller is spinning, and it's spinning really fast due to this turbine being driven by the exhaust, and you shut this throttle body, that pressure air is going to come through here. It's all pressurized, going to slam that throttle body, and you can cause some kind of damage and inefficiencies at the minimum. So they have this bypass valve that when you shut the throttle, like you're shifting, it's going to open up this valve, and it's going to blow air back to the uncharged side but filtered side of this intake tube, just in front of that impeller. Okay. Now right here, the air filter is also where it meters the air. If it's got a mass airflow system, if it's a speed density system, which means there isn't an actual direct sensor for measuring the air. It's kind of based on inferences and calculations. But I digress. Go back to the bypass valve. So there's two different styles of bypass valves. You have the bypass valve, which bypasses air to this intake tube between the impeller, the air filter, and air metering device. So it's all measured air, just rerouted back here. Or you have a blow-off valve, which blows air to the atmosphere. I'm not a fan of those just because that's metered air. So when air comes in through this filter, it's going to be metered through a mass airflow sensor of some sort. And coming through here, so that's metered air the computer thinks it has in its system. If it comes through this impeller and gets dumped out of this blow-off valve in the atmosphere, you're losing a little bit of that air. So that's going to affect your fuel mixture on the engine. The bypass valve just redirects it back to that tube to be drawn in again. Since you already have that air measured, it's not going to affect your air-fuel ratio. So again, that's how that works. Whether turbo or supercharger, that system works the same. And it comes down through, we'll talk about the charge air cooler in just a second, and then to the throttle body, to the engine, and then out the exhaust and whatnot. So that is basically the difference between a bypass and a blow-off valve. Everyone has their own opinion, which one they like. I have mine, but again, I'm kind of an OE guy. So speaking of charge air cooler, we're actually going to do a part 2 to this video, and we'll pick up right here where we left off.